A life of privilege, a future mapped out in gold and power. For most it would be a dream. But for Alara of the Silvermane Pack, it was a gilded cage. Tonight was the mating ceremony, the night she was to be bonded to a stranger for political gain. Everyone thought she would accept her destiny. But what happened when she decided to make a choice so shocking, it would unravel the very fabric of her world. Get ready for a story of defiance, hidden identities, and a love that blooms in the most unexpected of places. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The air in Alara's chambers was thick with the cloying scent of night-blooming jasmine, her mother's favorite. It was supposed to be calming, but to Alara, it smelled like surrender. Her maid, Liana, fastened the final clasp on her ceremonial gown, a breathtaking creation of moon-white silk and silver thread that felt as heavy as chainmail. "You look exquisite, my lady," Liana whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She knew. They all knew. This wasn't a celebration, it was a transaction. Alara was to be mated to Kale, the brutish beta of the Shadowfang pack, securing a vital alliance for her father, Alpha Theron. Kale's reputation for cruelty was a poorly kept secret, a stain on the pristine image of the ceremony. Alara stared at her reflection. The woman staring back had eyes like a winter sky, pale blue and full of frost. She was a prize to be won, a jewel in her father's crown. Her own wolf, a spirited creature she called Lyra, paced restlessly within her, a caged animal sensing its doom. The grand hall was a spectacle of opulence. Hundreds of pack members and dignitaries milled about, their laughter and chatter a dissonant symphony to Alara's ears. The air hummed with the raw power of so many dominant wolves. At the head of the hall sat her father, Alpha Theron, his face a mask of proud authority. Beside him, Kale stood, his gaze already possessive, a hungry smile playing on his lips. He was handsome in a sharp, severe way, but his eyes were dead, like chips of obsidian. The ceremony began. The ancient elder recited the old words, speaking of unity, strength, and the sacred bond of mates. Each word was a nail in the coffin of Alara's freedom. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating itself against its cage. This was it. The moment she would be tied to a monster for the rest of her life. Her eyes scanned the crowd desperately, not seeking a savior but an escape. A scandal. Anything was better than this fate. And then she saw him. Tucked away in a shadowy corner, near the archway that led to the servants' quarters, was a man. He was tall but hunched, his clothes worn and patched, a stark contrast to the finery around him. Dirt smudged his sharp cheekbones, and a shaggy mane of dark hair obscured most of his face. He was the lowest of the low, a beggar or a drifter permitted to watch the ceremony from the shadows as an act of pack charity. But it was his eyes that held her. Even from across the room, they burned with a quiet, intense intelligence, a flicker of something that didn't belong in a beggar's gaze. An insane, reckless idea ignited in Alara's mind. It was social suicide. It would disgrace her family. But it was freedom. It was a choice. The elder's voice boomed. "Alara of the Silvermane Pack, step forward and accept your destined mate." The hall fell silent. All eyes turned to her. Kale took a step forward, his hand outstretched. This was her last chance. Instead of moving toward Kale, Alara turned. Her white gown flowing behind her like a ghost, she walked away from the dais. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Her father's face began to darken with confusion, then anger. She didn't stop. She walked past the stunned nobles, past her wide-eyed friends, straight toward the dark corner. The beggar watched her approach, his posture stiffening. He didn't shrink away but stood his ground, his unusual eyes widening slightly in shock. Time seemed to slow. She could hear her father's sharp intake of breath, Kale's low growl of fury. Reaching the beggar, Alara did the only thing her panicked mind could conceive. She threw herself into his arms, clinging to his worn tunic, and pressed her face against his chest. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear in the dead silence of the hall. "I choose you. I claim you as my mate." The gasps that echoed through the hall were deafening. The air crackled with tension. The beggar's body was rigid against hers, hard with muscle that belied his ragged appearance. For a terrifying second he didn't move. Then slowly his arms came up, not to embrace her but to hold her steady. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her, surprisingly calm amidst the chaos. "Little wolf," he murmured, his words for her ears only. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Before she could answer, A roar of pure rage shattered the silence. Kale stormed toward them, his power flaring, a suffocating wave of dominance that made several weaker wolves whimper and lower their eyes. "You dare disgrace me with this filth?" Kale snarled, his face contorted with fury. He pointed a shaking finger at the beggar. "Remove your hands from her, vermin, before I tear them from your body." The beggar, still holding Alara, slowly turned his head to face Kale. The submissive hunch was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness. The air around them grew heavy. "The lady has made her choice," the beggar said, his voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge of steel that sliced through the tension. "It is done." Kale laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Done? Nothing is done until I say it is." He took another menacing step, his claws extending. Alara clung tighter to the beggar, her heart in her throat. She had wanted an escape, but she hadn't anticipated plunging herself and this innocent stranger into mortal danger. What had she done? Just as Kale was about to lunge, the beggar did something inexplicable. He gently but firmly moved Alara behind him, placing his own body as a shield. He didn't cower. He didn't plead. He simply stood there, facing down the enraged Beta, a king facing a rebellious subject. And in that moment, as Alara stared at his broad, protective back, a terrifying and exhilarating thought whispered from the depths of her soul. Her wolf, Lyra, who had been frantic with fear moments before, had gone completely still. And then she sent a single clear feeling to Alara. The king in rags. The silence that followed the beggar's words was more terrifying than any roar. It was the quiet of a forest holding its breath before a lightning strike. Kale's face, once contorted with arrogant fury, now flickered with pure, unadulterated shock. No one, least of all a ragged drifter, spoke to a beta of the Shadowfang pack in such a tone. Alara, hidden behind the beggar's solid frame, could feel the shift in the air. The oppressive dominance Kale had been radiating seemed to falter, as if hitting an invisible wall. The beggar's posture was no longer that of a hunched outcast. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, and the simple act of moving her behind him had been executed with an unnerving, natural authority. "You," Kale sputtered, his claws still extended, glinting in the torchlight. "You will die for this insult." The threat was meant to be final, but it came out sounding like a question. The beggar ignored him. He half-turned his head, just enough for Alara to see the sharp line of his jaw. His eyes, those startlingly intelligent eyes, met hers for a fleeting second. There was no fear in them. Only a deep, calculating calm that made her breath catch. "Stay behind me," he instructed, his voice low but firm. It wasn't a request. Alpha Theron finally found his voice, thundering from the dais. "Alara, get away from that creature at once. You have humiliated this pack enough for one night." His anger was a palpable force, a wave of heat that washed over the hall. But it was laced with something else: panic. His carefully orchestrated alliance was crumbling before his eyes. Alara didn't move. Her fingers, of their own volition, tightened their grip on the rough fabric of the beggar's tunic. Lyra, her wolf, was not just still, she was bowing. Internally, a profound, instinctual reverence flooded Alara's senses, silencing her own fear. This man was not what he seemed. Kale, enraged by the dismissal, let his control snap. With a guttural roar he lunged. He was a blur of speed and lethal intent, aiming to rip the beggar's throat out. The crowd screamed. The beggar didn't flinch. He didn't even shift into a fighting stance. As Kale closed the distance, the beggar simply lifted his hand, palm out. It was a gesture of such casual power that it seemed to defy physics. Kale slammed into an invisible barrier. The impact was audible, a sickening crunch of bone and a shocked grunt of pain. He was thrown backward as if swatted by a giant's hand, skidding across the polished stone floor until he came to a heap at the base of the dais. He lay there, dazed and whimpering, his dominant aura completely extinguished. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Only the most powerful alphas could project their will as a physical force. Who was this man? The beggar lowered his hand. His gaze swept the room, no longer focused on Kale, but on Alpha Theron. The air grew thick, heavy with a new kind of power. It wasn't the brute force of Kale's dominance. It was ancient, immense, and utterly terrifying. It was the weight of a mountain, the silence of a deep ocean. Wolves throughout the hall began to drop to their knees, their heads bowing without conscious thought. The compulsion was instinctual, primal. The beggar reached up and pushed the shaggy hair from his face. The dirt and shadows could no longer conceal the sharp, aristocratic planes of his features, the commanding set of his brow. The intelligence in his eyes now blazed as outright authority. "Alpha Theron," the man said, his voice no longer a gravelly rumble but a clear, resonant tone that carried to every corner of the hall. "You would trade your daughter, the very heart of your pack's future, to a brute who cannot even stand against a single command from a stranger. Is this the strength of the Silvermane pack? Is this your legacy?" Theron was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his throne. He looked from the broken beta to the commanding figure of the beggar. Recognition, slow and dreadful, dawned in his eyes. The stories, the descriptions, the power. "It cannot be," Theron whispered, his voice trembling. From the back of the hall, a group of figures who had been standing quietly, dressed in simple travelers' cloaks, now moved forward. As they walked, they threw back their hoods, revealing faces etched with strength and loyalty. They moved with the lethal grace of seasoned warriors. The lead warrior, a woman with fierce eyes and a scar across her cheek, stopped a few paces behind the beggar and dropped to one knee, pressing a fist to her heart. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice ringing with devotion. The word echoed in the stunned silence. "Majesty." The beggar, the king, turned his attention back to Alara, who was still clinging to his back, her mind reeling. He gently pried her fingers from his tunic and turned to face her fully. He took her hand, his grip surprisingly gentle despite the calluses on his palms. "You asked me if I knew what you had done," he said to her, his voice softening only for her. "The question, Alara of the Silvermane, is whether you know what I have done." He raised her hand, presenting her to the assembled, kneeling pack. "By our laws, a public claim unchallenged by a higher authority is binding. You did not choose a beggar to avoid your fate." He paused, his intense gaze holding hers, and in that moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. "You chose a king. And in doing so, you have just become my queen." The revelation hit Alara like a physical blow. The king. The missing, near-mythical Alpha King Rylan from the most powerful and reclusive pack on the continent. He had disappeared from public view years ago, rumors swirling of a quest, a betrayal, or madness. No one had imagined he had been wandering the lands in disguise, observing his potential allies and enemies from the shadows. Her act of desperation, her scandalous rebellion, had not just saved her from Kale. It had catapulted her into the center of a political storm she could scarcely comprehend. She had thought she was clinging to the lowest rung of the ladder to escape the one above. Instead, she had grabbed hold of the sun. Alpha Theron finally stumbled from his dais, falling to one knee. "My king. We had no idea. Please forgive our blindness." King Ryland's gaze hardened as he looked at Theron. "Your blindness is the least of your offenses, Theron. We will discuss the future of your pack and this alliance," he said, glancing with disdain at the still-prone Kale, "at a later time." He then turned to his warrior. "Lysandra, secure the hall. No one leaves." Alara stood frozen, her hand still in his. She was no longer a pawn in her father's game. She was a queen on a board she didn't know how to play. The cage had shattered, but she was now standing on a precipice, with a king by her side whose motives were as shrouded as his past. He had allowed her claim. But was it for her? Or was she simply a convenient piece in a much larger, more dangerous game he was playing? A court of shadows. The Silvermane Great Hall, once a symbol of her father's power, had become a prison under new management. King Ryland's warriors, a unit he called the Onyx Guard, moved with silent, lethal efficiency. They didn't need to bark orders or draw weapons. Their presence alone, radiating a disciplined, unified power, commanded absolute obedience. The guests were escorted to their quarters, each under a polite but firm watch. Kale was carried away by two stone-faced guards, his pride wounded far more severely than his body. Alpha Theron was given the courtesy of remaining in his own hall, but the two Onyx guards stationed at his side made it clear he was a host who had become a subject. Through it all, Alara stood rooted to the spot, her hand still enveloped in Ryland's. The warmth of his grip was the only thing that felt real in a world that had tilted off its axis. Queen. The word echoed in her mind, a hollow title for a role she had never desired. Ryland finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. The intensity that had faced down Kale and cowed her father was now focused solely on her, and it was overwhelming. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice low. "My presence has been revealed. There will be consequences." Consequences. Alara managed to whisper, her voice hoarse. "You're the king. What consequences could there be?" A shadow crossed his features, a glimpse of the weary man beneath the royal mantle. "A king has more enemies than friends, Alara. And a king who has been in hiding has even more. He didn't elaborate. Instead, he gave her hand a slight tug. Gather what you need. Only what is essential. We leave within the hour. He didn't wait for her agreement. He was already moving, pulling her gently but insistently through the crowd of kneeling wolves, his onyx guard falling into step around them like a living shield. They moved through the familiar corridors of her home, but it felt like a foreign place. The portraits of her ancestors seemed to stare down at her with judgment. She was leaving it all behind. Not as a bride to a neighboring pack, but as a captive of a king. Or was she a partner? The distinction was terrifyingly unclear. In her chambers, Lyanna was waiting, her face ashen with fear and awe. My lady, the king, is it true? Before Alara could answer, Ryland spoke from the doorway. You are her attendant? Lyanna dropped into a deep curtsy, trembling. Why, yes, your majesty. Pack a single bag for your lady. Practical clothes. Nothing from the ceremony. His orders were crisp, leaving no room for question. He then turned his gaze to Alara. I will give you a few moments. Lysandra will be outside your door. He left, closing the door behind him, and the room felt both emptier and less suffocating. My lady, what is happening? Lyanna cried, rushing to pack a small satchel as instructed. I don't know, Lyanna. I truly don't, Alara confessed, sinking onto her bed. She looked at her trembling hands. She had clung to a stranger to avoid a fate she hated, and in doing so, she might have leaped from the frying pan into the heart of the fire. Lyra, her wolf, was no longer bowing in awe but was restless, anxious. The king's power was immense, undeniable, but his motives were a dark, uncharted forest. The journey away from Silvermane territory was a blur. They traveled not on foot, but in sleek, black vehicles that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Ryland sat beside her in the back seat, his presence a silent, powerful force field. He didn't speak, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Alara stole glances at his profile. The dirt was gone, revealing skin weathered by sun and wind. The sharp angles of his face spoke of hardship, not just royalty. Who was this man? They arrived as the sun was beginning to paint the sky with hues of rose and gold. The king's citadel was not a glittering palace, but a formidable fortress carved into the side of a mist-shrouded mountain. It was all sharp angles, dark stone, and an air of impenetrable silence. It was beautiful in a stark, fearsome way, a far cry from the open, wooded lands of her home. Inside, the court was waiting. They lined the grand entrance hall, faces carefully neutral, but Alara could feel the weight of their scrutiny. Their eyes assessed her simple travel clothes, her pale face, the lack of a royal bearing. She saw the flickers of curiosity, skepticism, and in some outright hostility. These were not pack members bound by familial loyalty. These were politicians, warriors, and courtiers who had navigated the shadows of power while their king was away. Ryland did not introduce her. He simply walked forward, his hand on the small of her back, a gesture that was both possessive and protective. He led her past the bowing courtiers, up a sweeping staircase, and into a suite of rooms that overlooked a breathtaking, dizzying chasm. This will be your chambers, he said, his voice echoing in the spacious room. You are safe here. No one will enter without your permission, not even me. Alara turned to face him, finally finding her voice. Why? The single word held a universe of questions. Why did you let me claim you? Why are you doing this? What do you want from me? Ryland studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look right through her. For a second she saw the beggar again, the man with the intelligent, weary eyes. You offered me a choice in that hall, Alara, he said quietly. An honest choice, free of politics or power. You saw a man who had nothing and chose him over a prince. In my world such a thing is priceless. He stepped closer and the air crackled between them. But this is not the Silvermane pack. This is my court. Trust is a weapon here and kindness is a weakness. Your trial is not over. It has just begun. He turned and left, closing the heavy oak door behind him. The sound of the lock sliding into place was not the sound of a cage locking, but of a gate closing, separating her from the only person in this terrifying new world who held any answers. She was a queen in a castle of shadows, married to a king of secrets, and her first lesson was a chilling one. Her greatest danger might not be his enemies, but the man she had called her mate. The queen's gambit. The silence in the royal suite was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind outside the towering arched windows. Alara stood frozen for a long time after the door closed, the weight of the king's final words settling on her like a shroud. Your trial is not over. It has just begun. This was not the refuge she had imagined. It was a different kind of arena, one where the battles were fought with whispers and daggers hidden in smiles. The first day was a study in isolation. Her meals were delivered by a silent, stern-faced maid who offered no pleasantries. The books on the shelves were histories of wars and treaties, dry and intimidating. From her window, she watched the courtiers move through the courtyards below like pieces on a chessboard, their interactions a subtle dance of power and submission. She saw the way they glanced up at her window, their expressions unreadable. She was the curiosity, the beggar queen, the unexpected variable in their carefully balanced equations. On the second day a visitor arrived. It was Lysandra, the fierce warrior from the hall. She did not bow. She simply stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes assessing Alara with a cool, professional detachment. "The king has requested your presence in the map room," she stated. It was not a request. Alara's heart hammered, but she squared her shoulders, calling on every ounce of her alpha daughter's training. Very well. The walk through the citadel was a gauntlet. Courtiers paused their conversations to watch her pass, their stares like icy needles. She heard a faint, muffled laugh from a group of women dressed in exquisite silks. One of them, a stunning blonde with cold blue eyes, looked Alara up and down with undisguised contempt. This, Alara guessed, was the kind of woman they had expected their king to choose. The map room was a vast, circular chamber dominated by a massive table carved from a single ancient oak. Parchment maps were spread across it, weighted down by polished stones. Ryland stood over them, his brow furrowed. He looked every inch the king now, dressed in dark, functional leathers, a simple silver circlet resting on his brow. He dismissed Lysandra with a nod. "Alara," he said, not looking up. "Come. Tell me what you see." Cautiously she approached the table. The maps were not of his kingdom, but of the surrounding territories, including her own Silvermane lands. Markers were placed at various points, some painted black, others red. "I see a strategic overview of the border packs," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And?" he prompted, finally lifting his gaze to hers. It was a test. She took a breath, focusing. "The red markers, they're along trade routes. The black ones, they're near natural defensive choke points. You're mapping weaknesses and strengths." A flicker of something, approval, crossed his face. "The red are loyalists. Or at least, those who profess loyalty. The black are the packs who have grown, ambitious during my absence. Like the Shadowfangs." He tapped a black marker squarely on her former home. "Your father's proposed alliance was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger play. Kale's father, Alpha Zane, is making a bid for the throne." The pieces began to click into place, forming a terrifying picture. "You were in hiding to identify your enemies." "I was in hiding because 5 years ago, an attempt was made on my life," he said, his voice flat. "It came from within my own court. I needed to see the landscape without the filter of flattery and lies. I needed to find someone I could trust." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "The day of the mating ceremony, I was there to assess your father's allegiance. I found instead a woman brave enough to choose ruin over bondage." Alara's mind raced. Her reckless act had not just been convenient for him, it had been a beacon. "So, my claim, it was politically useful." "It was," he admitted without shame. "But it was more than that. My wolf recognized yours, Alara. Not just your strength but your integrity. In this den of snakes, that is the one weapon they cannot counter." Suddenly the door burst open. The blonde woman from the corridor strode in, her face a mask of feigned concern. "My king. Forgive the intrusion, but there is urgent news from the northern border. Scouts report Shadowfang movements." Her eyes slid to Alara. "Perhaps this is a matter best discussed in private. For security." It was a blatant power play, an attempt to exclude and diminish her. Ryland's expression turned to ice. "Lady Seraphine," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You will remember that Queen Alara is your sovereign. Any news you bring to me you may bring to her. In fact, from now on, you will address your reports to her first." Seraphine's face went white with shock. Alara's did too, but for a different reason. He was not just defending her, he was handing her the weapon. He was forcing the court to acknowledge her authority. Swallowing her fear, Alara stepped forward, placing herself between Ryland and the map table. She met Seraphine's hostile gaze. "Well?" Alara said, her voice cool. "You have your orders. Report." For a moment, Seraphine looked like she might refuse. Then, under the unyielding gaze of her king and the newfound steel in the queen's eyes, she capitulated. She bowed her head, a shallow, resentful gesture. "Your Majesty," she forced out. "The Shadow Fangs are massing their forces." In that moment Elara understood. The trial was not about surviving the court's gossip. It was about leading it. Rylan had thrown her into the deep end not to drown her but to prove she could swim. The scared girl who clung to a beggar was gone. In her place stood the Alpha King's chosen mate. The pawn had reached the other side of the board. The game had changed and she was no longer a piece. She was a player. From a desperate act of defiance to a queen claiming her throne, Elara's journey reminds us that our greatest leaps of faith can lead us to our true destiny. Her story shows that even when we feel we have no control, the choices we make from the heart can change everything. If this story of courage and unexpected love inspired you, then do us a huge favor. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful transformations, hit that like button if you were rooting for Elara, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Tell us in the comments what you thought King Rylan saw in her that night. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. Until next time.